everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is December the 30th, 2021, and I'm Barry Stagner. And just wanted to say thank you to all who have joined us this year. We started back in May doing these weekly broadcasts, and it's been awesome to see the audience grow and the viewership increase each week. And feel free to share this and let others know that we're doing this every week, and you can watch it archived there on YouTube. Even after the fact. So once again, thank you for your support and joining us, and very, very blessed to be with you each week. And also a happy new year. And I pray that your Christmas was blessed and a great time. And it's kind of another weird year. It seems like we're heading into another, but it is a new year, and we have every reason to be joyful. And our hope is in the Lord. And we are citizens of a city whose builder and maker is God. So even as the world gets weirder, the day grows closer where we're going to have that twinkling of an eye experience and forever be with the Lord. So keep your heads lifted up and be encouraged. And we are looking for that glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. So let's cover some stories here today. And the first one is kind of interesting to us here in the United States, and it comes from the Jewish News Syndicate. And the headline reads that Iranian-made UAVs are in Venezuela, 1,200 miles from Miami's skyscrapers. Iranian-made unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, are stationed in Venezuela on the northeast tip of South America, where some 2,000 kilometers, or 1,243 miles, separate them from the skyscrapers in Miami. The author of a new report has stated, Major Reserve Talbieri, head of the research department at the Alma Center, a defense watchdog located in northern Israel, said the new report highlighted a topic that until now has received little attention: the arrival of Iranian-made UAVs in the Western Hemisphere. The report notes that in general, Iranian-made UAVs compose thousands of unmanned systems, which are designed to gather intelligence to strike surface or air targets, either by launching missiles and bombs or conducting suicide explosive attacks by diving into the target. Now, Venezuela, essentially in the backyard of the U.S., is a state that the office of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, classifies as being, at least symbolically, a part of the radical Shiite axis, said Bieri, a former member of the IDF Intelligence Directorate. The Venezuelan regime, like Iran, is isolated. They share common interests and foster ties. Iran has clear economic and military interests in the country, and it is exploiting Venezuela's weakness, said Bieri. Venezuela, for its part, benefits by receiving military capacities in the form of UAVs from Iran, which it says are for domestic security use, such as protecting oil assets. Venezuela also swaps its heavy oil for Iranian condensate oil, which can be used to make gasoline, and which Venezuela can use to improve the quality of its tar-like crude, according to a Reuters report. The U.S. has been concerned over Iranian oil tankers and naval vessels traveling to Venezuela in recent months. In 2020, Khamenei's office published an image showing Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque surrounded by Iranian figures and Iranian proxy leaders. The image remarkably included Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro. Ultimately, the Iranians have marked out Venezuela as a potential base for some sort of activity against the U.S. in the future, Bieri told the Jewish News Syndicate. Now, this is interesting because that 1,200 miles is reduced dramatically if you consider that right off the coast of Florida, some 90 miles out there, is Cuba, ones who would most likely, at least governmentally, side with the Iranians, and the strain and stress between Cuba and the U.S. is no secret. And just an interesting proposition to consider because, 1,200 miles is still a good stretch, but there are, potential ramifications to this that could affect the U.S., especially the southern U.S. But again, other than the fact that there's a heavy Cuban population in Florida, and potentially just killing anybody randomly could be a part of the Iranian regime. But the true target would certainly be further north, up in the New York area, and certainly Washington, D.C. So something to keep an eye on. And I thought it was interesting that Bieri pointed out that this story is not receiving a lot of press. Here we've got Iranian-made UAV potential weapon-carrying drones 1,200 miles south of the U.S. And we have to remember that, the Iranians call the United States the Great Satan. Israel is referred to as the Little Satan. Some European countries are included in that title of Little Satan, but there is an absolute hatred for the United States by the Iranian regime. And again, as I say each time we mention this, we're not talking about the man on the street in Iran, the woman on the street in Iran, the Iranian people. We have people we know here in the States are wonderful, loving, caring people who want to raise their families and don't want anything to do with this hateful regime that has overtaken their country. So again, here we've got one of the major players. You couple that with the fact that the U.S. is absent from the protest of the invasion of Israel, which is, at least in part, spearheaded by the Iranians. They're one of the major countries mentioned in the Ezekiel invasion format in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate also reports that Israel will not allow Iran to transfer game-changing weapons to terror proxies. The defense minister was touring Ramat David Air Force Base in northern Israel and received an operational briefing. And the Iranian regime is unable to supply basic goods and services like education and water to its citizens, but it is continuing to invest a fortune in the nuclear program and in its proxies, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz stated on Tuesday after his tour. And during the tour in northern Israel, Gantz described the Islamic Republic as the biggest enemy of the nations and residents of the Middle East, and called on regional states to stop Iran's harm of their sovereignty and inhabitants. During the tour, conducted together with Air Force Major General Mikam Norkin, and the head of the Strategic and Iran branch, Major General Tal Kelman, Air Force officials displayed a large range of combat means and provided an operational briefing. This year as well, we have acted against threats against various fronts, which are fueled by Iran, said Gantz. Iran undermines its sovereignty in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and in other countries. It is seeking to ignite the region on the altar of the interest of its leaders, he added. Israel will not allow Iran to stream game-changing weapons to its proxies and to threaten its citizens, Gantz said. Speaking hours after media reports said Israeli jets struck containers at Syria's main commercial port at Latakia on the Mediterranean coast. Now, follow-up story from the English version of the Arab paper Al Arabiya. Israel can strike Iran tomorrow, the headline reads. Hezbollah might hit back, according to the new Air Force chief. Israel has the capacity to carry out a successful strike at Iran's nuclear sites as early as tomorrow, the incoming Air Force chief insisted on Wednesday. Israel could successfully strike Iran's nuclear program tomorrow if necessary, said Major General Tomar Bar, who will command Israel's Air Force in April, according to the Jerusalem Post. I have to assume it will happen in my time, and my shoulders already understand the weight of the responsibility, he added. He stressed that Israel can successfully destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. There is no way that we will operate there 1,000 kilometers from here, and I will return home without being able to say, I completed the mission. Currently, tensions are high over whether or not the Vienna talks to revive the abandoned 2015 Iran nuclear deal will succeed, and the U.S. has long been saying that if diplomacy failed with Iran, it was willing to turn to Plan B without specifying what Plan B actually is. Meanwhile, Washington ally Israel has grown impatient and has repeatedly announced it is preparing for a military strike on Iranian nuclear targets. Barr believes that should Israel strike Iran, Lebanon's Tehran-backed Shia militia Hezbollah will attack Tel Aviv. I have to assume that he, speaking of Hezbollah, Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, will automatically be all in. 30 years he has waited for this order, and there is no way he will not be there with the highest intensity, Barr said. We have to be prepared for this. Barr stressed that a potential third war with Lebanon would result in Israel's victory. So, again, as we mentioned last week, remember, Lebanon's on the northern border of Israel. And we do know that the invading forces in the Ezekiel war scenario, which does not name Lebanon, but if they're a proxy of Iran, that would certainly fly under that banner or covering, is making it in the news. And now here we've got another story that Hezbollah and their over 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel on any given day would indeed seek to strike Tel Aviv if Israel were to strike the nuclear facilities in Iran. Now, again, we've got lots of players, and I think most of us have agreed that it seems to be that the most likely catalyst to the Ezekiel war scenario is the Isaiah 17:1 prophecy being fulfilled, that Damascus becomes a ruinous heap. And every time we see some type of assault on storage facility or whatever it may be, research facility, as they like to call them in Syria, or anything potentially housing chemical weapons, that always points us back to the fact that Isaiah has prophesied. And let me just give you a little sidebar here. There are those who say, well, that was fulfilled by Sennacherib in the 6th century. And, well, that's not true, because there is a Damascus today. That eliminates Sennacherib's conquest as being not possible interpretation of Isaiah 17:1. It is at least they brag to be, the oldest continuously inhabited city on the face of the earth. So it has not become a ruinous heap in the past. It has always been inhabited. It is inhabited today. But once Isaiah 17:1 is fulfilled, it will be uninhabitable. There will be a place for jackals and wild beasts of the earth to roam. No human will dwell there. And that has never happened in the past. So we do know that this is coming. Now, you pair that with the fact that there could be an Iranian proxy strike through or via Hezbollah in response to a strike on Iran, which could coincide with a strike on Damascus. And who knows? But it's just interesting to see these things in the news, and so many of them making their way into the headlines that are pointing to things that we have long been watching and waiting for the fulfillment of. Now, I think that it's interesting to think about the fact that there's going to be responses to, especially the Ezekiel war scenario, that are divine in nature, earthquakes and hailstones and blood mingled with fire and all these other things that show the hand of God defending Israel, which is something that is exclusive to the tribulation period, at least the final 70th week of Daniel. And we haven't seen that sort of thing during the church age or the age of the Gentiles. So I believe that the Ezekiel war will start before the rapture. The rapture will happen most likely sometime during the exchange. And remember, the war lasts longer than it takes to read Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's not this little 15-minute deal, but it is finalized quickly when God intervenes. And the King James says 5/6 of the invading armies lay dead on the mountains of Israel. So that tells us that there's a breach of the border, and these military troops do make their way inside of Israeli territory, and God responds and takes them out. So others believe that the whole thing unfolds before the rapture of the church, and that's a possibility too. I think we have to always remember and not get critical of one another that the surest form of prophetic interpretation is fulfillment. So we don't know all the specifics and details. We do know that it's all going to go down, and we do know that before God pours his wrath out on the earth, the church is going to be gone. We don't have an appointment with wrath, according to 1 Thessalonians 5:9. So that's good news. But here we've got the talk escalating. Here we've got some of the activities being potentially described that could lead to the Isaiah 17:1 fulfillment, as well as launching or being the proverbial fuse that lights the powder keg of the Middle East. And that would be a strike in Syria and the elimination of Damascus as a city, as well as the end of the nuclear program in Iran by an Israeli strike there. So wild times we have, and it's not just about the bug and all the other things that we've been experiencing these past 2 years. And by the way, we've got some stories at the end that I think you'll find insightful and encouraging. One in particular is actually coming out of the government and is a positive, which we don't seem to hear much about that in these last days, but that's regarding the bug specifically. Breitbart says, and get this is interesting. Breitbart says, China is replacing soldiers with robots in Tibet due to poor performance. The Chinese military is reportedly moving a large number of unmanned ground vehicles into the Tibetan Plateau, taking over duties from ethnic Han soldiers in the People's Liberation Army who have trouble coping with the cold temperatures and the thin air of Tibet. A report from India Times Now News on Tuesday said over half of China's robot vehicles are headed for Ladakh, the region where China is facing off against Indian military over a disputed border. Both China and India fortified their military presence in Ladakh after a deadly hand-to-hand battle in the Galwan River Valley in June of 2020. And China's buildup was more industrialized and technologically sophisticated, but also plagued from its early days by reports of Chinese soldiers having considerably more difficulty adapting to the Himalayas than their Indian counterparts. According to the Times Now News, the PLA's Tibetan command has given up on cyborgs and gone straight to killer robots. And the PLA has moved 88 Sharp Claw unmanned ground vehicles, or UGVs, into Tibet, 38 of them in the western part of the province, close to where the Indian and Chinese armies are still face to face. The Sharp Claw UGV, manufactured by Norinco, a Chinese arms manufacturer, can be used for reconnaissance, patrolling, and transportation of weapons and logistical work in difficult terrain. It can also be fitted with weapons. Also in Tibet is the robotized Mule 200 manufactured by Zhongqiang Zhu Kong Technology Holdings. It has a range of about 50 kilometers, can navigate difficult terrain, and also carries about 200 kilograms of ammunition, supplies, or even weapons at a time. Remotely controlled by wireless, it can perform combat tasks if fitted out for fire support activities. The PLA has 120 Mule 200s in Tibet, more than half of which are in western areas. And the Sharp Claw UGV looks like a heavily armed lawnmower equipped with tank treads, cameras, and a machine gun. Now, many of you I know who have been around for a while remember Chuck Missler and some of the proposals he made about some of the imagery that is recorded for us in the book of Revelation, potentially describing man-made weapons, and the descriptions that John was trying to use the language of his day of some of the things he was seeing that would be relevant to all cultures and every day as the Holy Spirit inspired him to write. Chuck Missler incorporated things like this. I mean, a tank tread lawnmower size robotic device that can carry 200 milligrams of weapon or munitions or whatever it may be. And, here you've got some of the interesting looking descriptions in Revelation with tails of a scorpion. They fly and do all these other crazy things. So, it's possible that those are actually demonic things that come up out of the pit. And there are those who believe that it could be things such as these robots that conduct warfare on the surface of the earth on behalf of God, even though they may not be serving him. But indeed, he can use whoever he wants to carry out his will. Now, here's another interesting story, and we see so many things happening with the study of the mind today, and devices now being associated with the thought processes of man. And this comes from a paper called Great Game India. Now, listen to this. Paralyzed man composes first ever tweet with his thoughts using a brain implant. The first ever individual to tweet a message addressing the world with just the use of his thought and no other muscle is an Australian man who suffers from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. Australian brain-computer interface company Synchron made a press release on Thursday describing how one of its patients, Philip O'Keefe, a man who is 62 with ALS, was the first to tweet with the use of implantable brain-computer interface directly via thought. ALS has left O'Keefe paralyzed. Hello, world, O'Keefe tweeted from the official Twitter account of Synchron CEO Thomas Oxley. Short tweet, monumental progress. O'Keefe came into possession of the Stentrode brain-computer interface, according to Synchron, in April of 2020. He had been left unable to communicate with any of his close friends or family as a result of ALS. But a new set of small stent-mounted array of electrodes implanted within his brain via the jugular vein provided him with the ability to reconnect with the world again. When I first heard about this technology, I knew how much independence it would give back to me. The system is astonishing. It's like learning to ride a bike. It takes practice, but once you're rolling, it becomes natural. Now I just think about where on the computer I want to click. I can email, bank, shop, and now message the world via Twitter, O'Keefe said in a statement. O'Keefe is in the process of reconnecting with the world, claims Synchron. It's amazing the advancements that are being made and how people who have been basically sidelined by disease or injury and many now being able to walk through a device or a surgery or implant. And now here we've got communication with only the thoughts. And it is interesting in light of the fact that it is the mind that is going to be receiving strong delusion from the Lord of those who would not receive the love of the truth. And, here we see mankind trying to breach a realm that is the domain of God. And we see so many of these things with some of these gender fluidity people and messing with something that God has ordained. And, this is a wonderful thing. Don't get me wrong, but it just points how far man has advanced. And these types of things only are used or are often used, I should say, to underscore the fact that man doesn't need God, so God must not exist. So again, seeing the mind now being able to communicate a thought, and that's translated into words via Twitter, just an amazing technological accomplishment, but it does underscore the fact that man has long been trying to eliminate the possibility for God by replicating things that supposedly prove that there is no God. Much like what we see with evolution, that we don't need God to create all that there is in 6 night-day cycles. The universe can do that given enough time on its own. Elementary particles can self-arrange after a field of gas blows up for no apparent reason. And planetesimals begin to form, and they begin to bind together and become planets, and the gases leak out to the further realms of the atmosphere and, form gas planets, all these other things that are just, they're ridiculous is what they are. But they're all an effort to do the same thing, to prove that there doesn't need to be a supreme being who spoke all into existence. And now we're breaching the realm of the thoughts of man, and which God says are only evil continually during the last days. And the heart of man is deceitful above all things as well. So again, these technological advances are a blessing, and they kind of expose the reality that man is seeking to move further and further and further away from God. Now, the Epoch Times has a story that headlines, "Most Americans don't trust teachers, schools with children's gender identity." A majority of Americans say that male and female are the only two genders, and that schools shouldn't be allowed to counsel children about gender or sexuality without parents' consent, according to the results of a survey released on Monday. The survey was conducted by the Rasmussen Reports among 1,000 American adults from December 21st to 22nd, with a margin of error of plus or minus 3%, and at 95% confidence level. It comes amid a social media firestorm sparked by Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, who was accused of engaging in hate speech for insisting that there are only two biologically distinct genders. Transgender activists have accused J.K. Rowling of hate speech for saying it, but most Americans agree with the Harry Potter author that there are only two genders. Well, I got news. Science agrees with that too. Rasmussen asked participants whether they agree with the statement there are only two genders, male and female. The results show that 75% of them agreed with the statement, with 63% saying they strongly agree. Those identifying as Republicans, it was 82%, are more likely to strongly agree than Democrats, which is 47%, and independent or unaffiliated respondents, 60%. There are also more black, 68%, than white respondents, 63%, and those of other races, number 55%, who strongly agree that there are only two genders. Now, here's the interesting part about what we're seeing happen today. doesn't, we're being told all the time, trust the science, trust the science, trust the science. But why not trust the science that is proven time and again about genders? There's two, and the chromosomal arrangement identifies that as such. There's XX and XY, and that's the end of the list. And hermaphrodites and things like this, those aren't new groupings. That's just abnormalities. And that doesn't create a new classification of gender. There's just two. There's male and female, consistent with what the Bible says. And yet, what's going on at the highest level of government here in our country and around the world? People are being forced, people are being fired for saying that the gender list is two. And how is it a hate crime to say something that is actually biologically and genetically sound, as just not even considering the fact that the Bible says the gender list is two, male and female, according to the one who initiated the whole process. That's the manufacturer's description, by the way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in it, including male and female. So mankind, male and female. So again, this is interesting that we see, basically, especially in our country, where the mantra has been a government of by the people and of the people, by the people, and for the people. And yet the people's opinion, based on scientific fact, is irrelevant, because you can be punished for a crime. If you say that there are only two genders, you can be fired from your job. You can be laid off without pay, all kinds of repercussions. And there can be serious consequences for saying something that is scientifically sound. And on top of that, the majority of Americans believe it. And whatever happened to majority rule? It just doesn't even exist anymore. And the truth of the matter is, we're seeing just basically a logical thought flying out the window. And we are, headed into that season where God is going to send man strong delusion, because he will not believe, did not believe the love of the truth, or accept the love of the truth, which is the person of Jesus Christ. So here we've got 75% of adult Americans believing that the gender list is two, and yet what's happening in Washington, D.C. is exactly the opposite. Claims up to, I saw a claim over the weekend. Someone had touted that there are some 100 different genders. What an absolutely ridiculous statement. What happened? Well, the press picked it up and ran with it. And so that's the new number. Last time I heard anything solid about it presented by the media, it was 67. Now it's all the way up to 100. Who knows what's next? So I'm going to stick with God. There's two. There's male and there's female, and that's it. Now, interesting, here in California, we've got another story. This one comes out of CNN, and this is, weather related. So we don't have any CNN twisting here, because these are facts coming from AccuWeather. As of Tuesday, more than 202 inches of snow, or nearly 17 feet, has fallen so far this month at the University of California, Berkeley's Central Sierra Snow Laboratory at Donner Pass, east of Sacramento. Scientists at the lab said this month that it is now the snowiest December on record for that location, and the third snowiest month overall. The top month was January 2017, when 238 inches or 6 meters fell, and it's not likely enough snow will fall in the next 3 days to challenge that record, and the records here go back to 1970. Lab officials said the snow was deep and hard to get through. It took them roughly 40 minutes to get to where the measurements are taken, just 150 feet away from the lab's front door. It's a ton of snow and was much needed. But, and here's why I wanted to read this article. Andrew Schwartz, the lead scientist and station manager of the Sierra Snow Laboratory, said, we're going to need a lot more. While this event has been amazing so far, we are really concerned about the upcoming months not having as many storms, Schwartz told CNN. If we don't get another inch, we're still below what we would expect for the entire winter, which means that we can contribute to the drought rather than resolving it. We are 8 days into winter. If we don't get another inch, we're still below what we would expect for the entire winter. Well, winter's still got 2 months and 3 weeks to go, so what a foolish comment. High elevation snowpack serves as a natural reservoir that eases drought, storing water through the winter months and slowly releasing it through the spring melting season. Snowpack in the Sierra Nevada accounts for 30% of California's fresh water supply in an average year, according to the California Department of Water Resources. The snowpack in the Sierra was at alarmingly low levels at the end of last winter, and reservoirs, which are replenished by spring snow melt, are still below the historical average. The snow on Spring Street in Nevada City, California, has been shown on Monday as in relation to the Lake Oroville Reservoir being 37% full, which is low compared to its historical average at this time of year of 71%. The Oroville hydroelectric power plant was forced to shut down this summer because of its low water level for the first time since it opened in 1967. Scientists have found climate change is not just increasing the severity of extreme weather, it's interrupting the natural patterns, causing wild swings between dry and wet extremes. California has seen this weather whiplash in recent years, where atmospheric river storms caused destructive floods one year and extreme drought causing water shortages the next. Similarly, Schwartz said they see conditions at the summit switch from a snow-free winter to blizzard next season. But he also said snow is clearly decreasing in the Sierra Nevada, and that's really going to be what we see and what we do see frequently up here. So, there just has to be bad news. There can't be anything positive coming from this as it relates to climate change. There can't be an end to the drought. Even as we reported on a story not too long ago where there was a headline that read, rain is not going to bring an end to the drought. Well, drought by definition is a lack of rain. So how else do you bring an end to the drought? You just got to keep pitching this climate change deal, or man-caused climate change, and failing to recognize climate does change, and it changes on its own. Now, let me say this before anybody sends me an email. Of course, we got to take care of the planet. We have to remember that God put Adam in the garden before the fall to tend and keep it, to make sure that it was well maintained and cared for. We don't know what that exactly included, but he put Adam to work. And work's not part of the fall. God put Adam to work before man fell, and it was to tend the garden. So, of course, we ought to take care of the planet. Of course, we ought to watch out for ourselves and not make sure that we've got trash floating in our oceans and all those things. I mean, those are no-brainers. That's just good common sense. But, all these other things that are being touted, that, we're going to see the sea levels rise and just these astronomical number of feet and all these things, it's just hype. And as I've mentioned in time past, Genesis 8 says, God said the seasons are going to continue as long as he's in control. And winter and summer, seed time and harvest, he is going to maintain the hydrologic cycle so that this planet can sustain life. So anyway, God's in control. But, again, you can't have something that just be a positive and leave it positive. It was record breaking, but not enough. And then to make such a statement, 8 days in a winter, that if we don't get any more, we're well below the average. Well, we're going to get more. As a matter of fact, as I sit here in Southern California, it's raining right now, and they're evacuating homes here in Orange County because of flooding. So we're getting rain. There's no doubt about it. If we're getting rain, Northern California is getting snow. Our next article comes from Gizmodo. It's 65 degrees in Alaska in December. Alaska has never had a hotter December day, with Kodiak smashing the state's all-time record for any month between November and March. Another day, another incomprehensible temperature record. This time, the unwanted accolade goes to Alaska, which set a statewide temperature record for December just days before the end of the year, according to the National Weather Service. The Kodiak tide gauge recorded temperatures for the state hovering at 67 degrees Fahrenheit, a number one would expect in early autumn New York during non-dune times. More alarming still were the daily temperatures set, in particular Alaskan locales. Kodiak Airport, located in Kodiak Station, recorded 65 degrees, 9 degrees higher than the station's previous all-time high. Kodiak City also shattered its own single-day record by a jaw-dropping 20 degrees, according to the National Weather Service. To put that in perspective, in addition to setting the record December temperature, the 65 degrees seen in Kodiak was the highest on record for the city for any day in November, January, February, or March. Cold Bay, a small town in the Alaskan Peninsula, meanwhile beat its own daily record by 18 degrees Fahrenheit. I was thinking about an encounter I had many, many years ago with a scientist. He was kind of edgy, and a lot of people thought he was a nut, and he did say some nutty things. But what he was, his name was Ivan Browning. He's the one that predicted New Madrid fault earthquake in the center of the country of a magnitude that would split the country in half. And that didn't happen. But there is a New Madrid fault, and it has been active. But I actually was at an event where I wound up sitting right next to him. And he was giving a presentation on the magnetic shift of the Earth. And it was interesting in that he was mentioning the fact that this was 40 years ago. He was mentioning the fact that as the magnetic field changes, weather patterns are going to change with it. And here we've had stories talking about the fact that the true magnetic north, the north point, the magnetic north point on the Earth has been moving rapidly and headed towards Siberia. We've been reporting stories about that for the last couple of years. So, it's not unusual to see the weather changing with that when the magnetic field of the Earth does change. And some are saying we're in the midst of a polar axis shift where the North will become the South Pole and vice versa. Some say that happens over thousands of years. Others say it happens instantaneously and is cataclysmic, which would line up with some of the events of tribulation. But interesting that here we are seeing these things, and it's being blamed on man, and man is causing all this, where there's no mention of the magnetic field of the Earth moving, which absolutely impacts weather patterns. So listen to this story in contrast to what we just read about the heat wave. Alaska, Ice-mageddon warning follows, heat record. Temperatures soared to a record 67 degrees on the island of Kodiak on Sunday, 7 degrees warmer than the state's previous high. But elsewhere in Alaska, temperatures have been plunging to record lows. In the southeastern town of Ketchikan, temperatures dropped to negative 18 Celsius or minus 4 Fahrenheit on December 25th, one of the town's coldest Christmas days in the past century. The weather extremes have prompted warnings of an ice-mageddon from authorities as torrents of rain and snow have left ice as hard as cement coating the roads. Experts say warm air pouring in from Hawaii has made Alaska's air, usually cold and drying during December, more moist. This has meant heavy rain and snowstorms are more likely in interior regions away from the balmy coastal areas. More people in more places. That was an advertisement. Forgive me. Heavy snowfall was followed by torrential rain that left the region coated with ice as the rain quickly froze, resulting in widespread power failures, road closures, and offices being shut. Thick ice formed on the roads and made them treacherous for drivers, warned the Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities. And let me remind you again in Matthew 24, in verses 3 through 8, where Jesus was talking about the birth pang-like progression of last days events that are the sign when they increase dramatically that is coming is near, includes seismos. And as I mentioned before, I'll repeat it again, seismos is not strictly geological. It can also mean that word seismos can be translated as a gale or tempest, which would include atmospheric type events. So we would see an exponential increase in earthquakes under the use of that word, as well as atmospheric events, strange and anomalies happening weather-wise. And here you've got one state that's having record highs and record lows at the same time. Now, Alaska is a big state, but still, that is kind of a strange phenomenon. Now, I've got a couple stories here that we should probably head under the "you got to be kidding" file. And this one, and I've talked about this before, where the Bible talks about in the last days that that there will be children given for rulers at the time where the Lord shakes the earth in Isaiah chapter 3, and basically that's a reference to incompetent leadership or unqualified leadership, and boy, do we have it around the world today. And listen to this. It makes my head spin. This has got to be one of the stupidest things that we've ever heard coming from people in places of power in this country, and that would include the IRS. Listen to this headline from the USA Today. Stole something? IRS says stolen property and bribes must be reported as income. I don't even know if I need to read this story. But is that like the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard? IRS says stolen property and bribes must be reported as income. Well, what do? Do you get a 1099 from the person you stole the stuff from? Or how exactly do you go about that? And what do you file it as? Do you put down, I stole the car and its value was X number of dollars? I mean, how ridiculous is this? And yet, this is true and absolutely insane. The article says, did you steal a car in 2021? How about taking a bribe? If you did, the IRS says, make sure you report it on your taxes. Those provisions went viral Monday following a tweet alerting taxpayers to those somewhat surprising requirements to note the value of your ill-gotten gains. Tax season is around the corner, read the tweet from Light Capital. Remember to report your income from illegal activities and stolen property to the IRS. The requirements can be found at irs.gov amid other missives to report income earned from jobs in the gig economy and what to do about taxable alimony payments. If you steal property, you must report its fair market value in your income in the year you steal it, unless you return it to the rightful owner in the same year. Read the provision for stolen property. What if you're dealing drugs or caught up in other crimes? In that case, the IRS publication says jot your earnings down on line 8Z, Schedule 1 of your 1040 form, or on Schedule C if from your self-employment activity. And don't forget to report any bribes or kickbacks you took in the course of doing business. The kickbacks also go on Schedule 1 or Schedule C, while the IRS says bribes should simply be included in your income. The Twitterati had a field day. If I steal a bunch of TVs from Walmart and a homeless man steals them from me, can I write them off as a loss? Read one tweet. Suppose you report your stolen stuff, you legally get to keep it, right? Asking for a friend. An IRS spokesman confirmed the provisions are on its website, but declined to comment further. No kidding. I'd want to hide too. And again, this is why the world is going to believe that a man claims to be God and monitors all buying and selling, and only by bowing to him, only receiving his mark, can you conduct business on the earth during the tribulation period. And listen, this is one of the things that I mentioned over the years in teaching on Bible prophecy. This mentality doesn't happen during the tribulation. It doesn't happen because of the tribulation. It's the cause of the tribulation. Just an out-and-out rejection of God, a belief in Looney Tune things, and these absolutely bizarre things are normalized, like this story. And the Internal Revenue Service of the United States of America is expecting someone who stole something to report it as income. Now, I suppose there must be an honesty is the best policy page on their forms as well, but what a ridiculous thing. But here, we've got people in places of power in the United States of America actually expecting this to happen, or at least taking it to the point where they will put it on their forms. The New York Times says, and here's what I mentioned earlier, a bit of good news. It's kind of a softening of so much of what we hear these days. And we've got this new Omicron variant. But the New York Times ran an article that says Omicron variant might help defend against Delta, a lab study suggests. People who have recovered from an infection with the new Omicron variant may be able to fend off later infections from the Delta variant, according to a new lab study carried out in South Africa by scientists. If further experiments confirm these findings, they could suggest a less dire future for the pandemic. In the short term, Omicron is expected to create a surge of cases that will put a massive strain on economies and healthcare systems around the world. But in the longer term, the new research suggests an Omicron-dominated world might experience fewer hospitalizations and deaths than one in which Delta continues to rage. Omicron is likely to push Delta out, said Alex Segal, a virus expert at Africa Health Research Institute in Durban, South Africa, who led the new study. Maybe pushing Delta out is actually a good thing, and we're looking at something we can live with more easily and that will disrupt us less than the previous variants. He posted the new study on the Institute's website Monday. It has not yet been published in a scientific journal. Independent scientists said that the results of the South African experiment, although preliminary, are sound. Carl Pearson, a health researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, said the findings were consistent with what is now happening in England. Omicron arrives, grows rapidly, the Delta trend switches to declining, he said. And Nathan Grubaugh, a public health researcher at the Yale School of Public Health, said he was observing the same pattern in Connecticut. We are seeing Omicron exponentially rise while Delta cases are falling, he said. This suggests to me that Omicron is outcompeting Delta for susceptible individuals, leaving them less susceptible to Delta in the aftermath and driving down Delta cases. Now, to me, this is fascinating because this is following the same exact pattern of the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. 3-year cycle. It mutates into a less lethal form and then simply fades from the scene. And this is what these things do. This is what viruses do and the microbes that make them up. They keep mutating to different forms until they mutate into something that isn't harmful at all. And this is what we're seeing. And we've heard about function of gain or gain function and all these other things and making things more lethal. And I think we've all got an education that we really didn't want to have over the past years. But this is the pattern, and this is exactly what happened. And I mentioned this some time ago that the third year was when the Spanish flu went away. So hopefully this is a precursor that Omicron is actually going to eliminate Delta, which has been fierce in its attack on countries around the world. And Omicron has been reported as being far, far less lethal. So hopefully we've got some positive stuff coming our way as far as the pandemic goes. Now, the Epoch Times is reporting Dr. Peter McCullough says vaccine mandates should be repealed, and COVID-19 jab mandates have to be repealed as they are still in research and people cannot be mandated to participate in research, says Dr. Peter McCullough. McCullough, a cardiologist, epidemiologist, and internist who manages COVID-19 patients with heart-related complications and patients who become ill after receiving a vaccine, contends that the vaccine mandates violate the Nuremberg Code. When it comes to research, research can only be voluntary, and under no circumstances can anyone receiving pressure, coercion, or a threat of reprisal cannot violate the cornerstone of ethics. Unethical is immoral to do that, he says. McCullough notes that the CDC and FDA have yet to publish their first monthly safety report on the vaccines, and that as of December 17th, the CDC VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, has reported 20,622 deaths post-vaccination globally and over 983,000 adverse events, while VAERS has issued a disclaimer discouraging interpretation of its data to reach conclusions about existence, severity, frequency, or rates of problems associated with the vaccine. McCullough says the system's death reports deserve serious attention. He cites a June 2021 analysis of VAERS COVID-19 vaccine death reports led by the University of London Scott McLachlan. And McLachlan found that, contrary to claims that most of these reports are made by lay people and are hence clinically unreliable, health service employees reported at least 67% of the cases that have been reported to VAERS. So again, the legality of this, and I thought that was an interesting, the Nuremberg issue being brought in, that you can't, as we know the Nazis did, ran all kinds of tests on humans, and thus it is internationally illegal to force people to be tested. And, these things were activated under an emergency act. None of them have been approved. Not one has actually been approved. It hasn't been in existence long enough to go through all the proper testing stages. So they were approved under Emergency Act. And basically they are, as the doctor said, experimental, and people are being forced to participate in this experiment. So don't know where that's going to go, but it's true nonetheless. Now, here's another story that makes you scratch your head, and I think most of us have talked about this in the past. And the Associated Press is reporting the flu is making a comeback in the U.S. after an unusual year off. The U.S. flu season has arrived on schedule after taking a year off, with flu hospitalizations rising and 2 child deaths reported. Last year's flu season was the lowest on record. likely because of COVID-19 measures, school closures, distancing, masks, and canceled travels. No, likely because they're calling flu deaths COVID deaths and running the numbers up. We've all talked about that. Listen, this is setting itself up to be a more normal flu season, said Lynette Brammer, who tracks flu-like illnesses for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The childhood deaths, Brammer said, are unfortunately what we would expect when flu activity picks up. It's a sad reminder of how severe the flu can be. And during last year's unusually light flu season, one child died. In contrast, 199 died from the flu 2 years ago and 144 before that. In the newest data, the most intense flu activity was in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C., and the number of states with high flu activity rose from 3 to 7 in CDC figures released on Monday. So again, the trust issue is such a major thing in our all of our hearts and minds today. And these groups of people that ought to be the most trustworthy, especially those who've sworn the Hippocratic Oath, that they would cause others no harm, and to simply ignore or cover up the fact that these jabs are taking people's lives, numbering over 20,000 with 93,000 adverse or 900,000 adverse reactions to it. And it's just stunning to see the world that we live in today. And, some of these things I was talking with somebody at church on Sunday and about some of these bizarre things going on in our world. And it just reminds me and how much I am grateful that God is long suffering. Now, he is patient. And I'm glad that, and I was telling this friend of mine, good thing I'm not God in charge of lightning bolts, because there'd be some folks getting them. But God is not human. He isn't given to emotional or knee-jerk reactions. He is patient. He is kind. He is unwilling that any should perish. And even in these horrid and heinous times where there's so much evil around us, so many who are just flat out lying about things that have long been known to be scientifically true, yet God is still allowing things to continue, wanting people to come to know him. He's still unwilling that any should perish. But we also know that his spirit will not always strive with man, and there is going to come a time, I believe that time has been predetermined before the foundation of the world, because it's identified as a day and an hour, not a number of people saved, but a day and an hour. It's already set, and it's going to happen, and nothing will change it. Nothing can stop it. And I believe that day is close, and soon we're going to be going home. The Gazette says Rand Paul states Fauci is responsible for thousands of COVID deaths due to de-emphasizing therapeutics. Rand Paul is going after Dr. Anthony Fauci again, this time on his father's show. Paul said Monday on the Ron Paul Liberty Report that he thinks thousands die in the United States every month from the bug because of Fauci de-emphasizing therapeutics in favor of vaccines. I think Fauci is of the philosophy that vaccines are incredibly successful and are the way to go versus therapeutics, Paul told his father. Paul claimed Fauci has a bias toward vaccines for years, pointing to his involvement in the AIDS epidemic. He said Fauci wanted to develop a vaccine for AIDS, which he claims some people think hindered the development of therapeutic solutions. Paul said the therapeutic solution ended up being the best in combating AIDS, and Fauci's bias for vaccines then is the same as it is now. The Republicans like Paul and Texas Senator Ted Cruz calling for his prosecution is nothing but noise in the political sphere, saying they criticize science because I represent science, according to Fauci. Paul claimed on social media that statement was astounding and alarming because I represent science. Paul told radio and television host Dan Bongino on December 13th that COVID-19 restrictions are really about conditioning people to submit to the government. Bingo, brother. And people are going to be conditioned for this before it arrives during the tribulation period, saying there doesn't seem to be an endpoint to growing government restrictions related to the bug. Now, you combine this with our next story, and it makes for the difficult times in which we now live. And CNBC reported that millennials lead shift away from organized religion as pandemic tests America's faith. A Pew Research Center survey found 29% of U.S. adults said they had no religious affiliation, an increase of 6 percentage points from 2016. Millennials are leading the shift away from organized religion, according to the survey. More faith leaders are stepping up their outreach efforts from social media to revamp sermons to attract these younger adults. Well, the Bible says actually preach the word in or out of season. And that means whether it's popular or not, received or not, preach it anyway. It is not uncommon for people to seek God during times of hardship. However, the opposite appears to have happened in the U.S. during the COVID pandemic. A Pew Research Center survey released earlier this month found 29% of U.S. adults said they had no religious affiliation, an increase of 6 percentage points from 2016, with millennials leading that shift. A growing number of Americans said they are also praying less often. About 32% of those polled by the Pew Research Center from May 29 to August 25 said they seldom or never pray. That's up 18% from of those polled by the group in 2007. The secularizing shifts evident in American society so far in the 21st century show no signs of slowing, said Gregory Smith, Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. The trend is pushing an increasing number of faith leaders to try and engage millennials on their own turf. I use Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, stories, all sorts of things to go where people are, and that's where a lot of young people are, said the Reverend James Martin. Martin, a Jesuit Catholic priest in New York City and editor-at-large of America Magazine, he's among the religious ministers who embraced social media at the height of the pandemic when places of worship were forced to shut their doors. I started these Facebook Live programs at the beginning of the pandemic because I felt that people were really lacking a sense of community. Anything I can do to help people encounter God is important. Now, that one statement I find to be really interesting. People were lacking a sense of community. I started Facebook Live programs because people were sensing a lack of community or lacking a sense of community. So sense of community can be found on a computer screen or on a device or on an iPad, a smartphone or an iPad. And that points to the fact that this global worship of the beast is going to be through devices. Has to be. The only way that the whole world can watch an event simultaneously or, see the image of the beast that is based in we do know the abomination of desolation will take place in Jerusalem in the rebuilt temple. But wherever this image is built, it's going to be broadcast all over the world. So this relationship and sense of community is important in our world today. And still, as churches reopen across the U.S., attendance has been slow to pick up. The median in-person attendance has dropped by over 12% in the past 18 months, according to a study published in November that was led by Hartford Institute for Regional Research. While the trend is a cause for concern for houses of worship, it also serves as a wake-up call for religious leaders, listen to this, to refine the way they connect with their members, Martin said. I think it's taken a while, but most churches and religious organizations have realized this needs to be addressed. At the East End Temple in New York City, Rabbi Joshua Stanton has given his sermons a jolt of energy and an appeal to new congregants. My sermons are getting shorter and shorter and more open. Change the message to get the people is basically what he's saying. And what I try to encourage people to do is discuss them with me, argue about them, navigate with them, and come and study together so we can all share an understanding. In other words, the community decision on what's right and true. Stanton, 35, said he's also encouraging a safe haven in which members feel free to debate and argue with one another. The spiritual experience will never go away. The need to find meaning and purpose in our existence will never go away. The story goes on and on and on about efforts to reach people today and get people into the room, and the method is according to the result. The means justify the end. And what a time that we now live in. And that's the way to end our program today, because the Bible said in the last days, men would not put up with sound doctrine, but would heap up teachers for themselves who would satisfy their itching ear needs and tell them fables instead of facts. And boy, that's where we are at today. What a sad reality that, religion as a whole on the decline is nothing to cry about. But when you include the relationship with God in that percentage bracket, then that's something to be troubled by. But we also should expect that in the last days, 2 Timothy 3:1-5 says the days will be perilous. And the first reason is because people will be lovers of themselves. It also says in that passage, they'll be haters of God. And this is what we're seeing today. And it is the reason that the world is in the shape that it's in today. That is why we have such incompetent leaders in so many places of power. That's why we have such ridiculous propositions like make sure you put your gains from your ventures, your illegal ventures on your tax form so you can pay the taxes on them. And this just says this world has lost its mind completely. And the more we advance, as we talked about with the brain communication story, the farther away man seems to move from God. Well, the Lord's coming back. He's first going to come get his church. And then we're going to enjoy the marriage supper of the Lamb, be standing before the bema seat of Christ, receive our rewards, and we're going to come back with him at the end of the tribulation and rule and reign with him for 1,000 years on this earth. So we have much to look forward to. And listen, just kind of as an encouragement in this new year, I mentioned this to the church on Sunday, and I think we need to remember that, the church is doing fine. There's just a lot of things called church that aren't church. But the born-again believer is doing fine. We have a blessed hope. And we, I think, collectively as a body of believers who understand that the Bible, all of it doesn't contain the Word of God. It is the Word of God. We have such reason to rejoice and have hope in these last days. And listen, as the new year begins and resolutions are being made, let me challenge you. Make a resolution about your Christian life and experience, or your relationship with God. All these resolutions are great, and we know, that the gyms will be more full in January than the donut shop, and then things will reach equilibrium again by March, and both places will be equally full. One will increase, the other decrease. You know what I mean? But how about adding something spiritual? I'm going to tell X number of people a month or a week about Jesus. Maybe some of you even need to say, I'm going to tell somebody for the first time about Jesus, because it has been reported, sadly, by Barna Group and others, that 95% of Christians have never led anyone to Christ. Let's not be among those numbers. So tell people about Jesus. Make a commitment. Make a resolution. Make a commitment. Resolve to do this year. And it'll be a year unlike any other if you make a commitment to honor the Lord, tell other people about him more than you ever have in previous years. And for however long the Lord leaves us here, it'll be a glorious year, even in the midst of the perilous times in which we now live. Well, that's it for today. And thank you again for joining over this past 6 months that we've been doing this. And as I said, just appreciate your support in the comments online, most of them. And just great to see the viewership increase. Share this on social media. Hey, go to Telegram and follow me there as well. Been trying to throw out some stories that are of interest throughout the week as we move towards each Thursday. But next time I see you, it'll be 2022 if the Lord should tarry. But either way, I'll see you here, there, or in the air.